NATO, the historic alliance, arguably the most successful alliance in history, is dead. Technically, it's still functioning. It just completed its largest exercise, Steadfast Dart 25, with over 10,000 troops practicing rapid deployment along its eastern flank, like those zombie spiders that keep moving long after the fungus has killed them. But the thing that gave NATO life doesn't exist, and so its ability to serve the purpose for which it was created is wholly uncredible, and its adversary knows it. Quick reminder, the point of NATO in its founding purpose was twofold: deterrence and stability. In those days, the Soviet Union, with its massive military presence in Eastern Europe, its stated desire to spread its ideology across the world by persuasion and by conquest, the US and its then allies in Western Europe and Canada saw a united front as the way to counterbalance that power and deter a future devastating war. The preamble of the treaty makes it clear the alliance was, quote, to safeguard the freedom, common heritage and civilization of its members, rooted in democracy, individual liberty and the rule of law. At that point, this was pragmatism. The US saw that in the post-World War II world, the democracies of Western Europe were economically depleted, politically vulnerable and militarily weak. The US feared that it would lose these allies to Soviet influence without a binding pact. The realpolitik of NATO was famously described by its first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, who said that its mission was keeping the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. At the heart of NATO was one big promise. Article 5. An attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. No ifs, no buts, that's the promise. Now, in just 6 weeks, it's become clear that the Trump administration has declared any such promise to be null and void. Just the other day, Trump was saying that America would, at best, pick and choose which NATO allies it would actually defend based on how much they paid towards their own defence. Made it sound like they were paying NATO, like you would pay a private security firm. But all members pay their dues to NATO. Where some historically have fallen short is the percentage of their own GDP that they spend on their own defence forces. And very tellingly, he turned it around and he said this.
And the biggest problem I have with NATO, I really, I know the guys very well. They're friends of mine. But if the United States was in trouble and we called them, we said, we got a problem. France, we got a problem. A couple of others I won't mention. Do you think they're going to come and protect us? They're supposed to. I'm not so sure.
And he made it clear that he couldn't see why they would. Obviously, people were quick to jump on this and to point out that, yes, of course, the only time Article 5 has ever been invoked, it was on behalf of America after the September 11th attacks. And yes, all those countries were ready to meet their promise under the terms of the NATO treaty on that occasion. Plus President Macron of France, the country that Trump specifically included in his suggestion of those that wouldn't help. Obviously, he felt that he had to respond. So he told reporters that France had shown respect and friendship to the United States and, quote, we are entitled to ask for the same thing. But when Trump says he can't see why they would, what he's really saying is that he's clear that he wouldn't. When Macron says France is entitled to ask for the same respect and friendship, it's because they can see that's not what they're being offered. We've already seen with Ukraine, Trump's first question in every situation so far is, what's in it for me? In history, the answer for NATO was that the US benefited from the stability and deterrence that NATO provides. But that requires a strategic view of geopolitics that it's not clear Trump is that much interested in. So while Trump was saying that countries that have in relatively recent history, had their soldiers die for America, that they wouldn't do exactly that. What others were hearing is that he wouldn't do that. Now, this isn't news to anybody at this point. I mean, at least it shouldn't be. Since the Trump administration showed itself to be embracing the worldview of Putin's Russia and framing itself as an adversary to Ukraine, the whole purpose of NATO is suddenly turned upon its head. Current political leaders and the current Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, are obviously saying that NATO is alive and well, and all that needs to happen is European countries need to spend more on their own defence, just like Trump said they should. So, for example, Rutte said this: "The transatlantic relationship and the transatlantic partnership remains the bedrock of our alliance. President Trump has made clear the commitment of the US and his commitment personally to NATO." These are words spoken in the hope that the subject will hear them and somehow be inspired to live up to them, more than they are in the actual belief that they are true. Britain remains hamstrung by its increasingly forlorn hope to be able to bridge the divide between Europe and the US, so Minister Stephen Kinnock told Times Radio, asked to respond to Trump's statement that he wouldn't defend some NATO members if their defence budgets didn't meet his approval, he said, "I think there's no issues really around the challenge that the United States has set for us as European nations." And he echoed Rutte by saying that Trump was totally committed to Article 5 in spite of the fact that his most recent comments are not compatible with Article 5. That's my addition, not his. The one exception to this has been the likely next German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who has said that NATO might not survive in its current form and there needs to be an independent European defence capability, and soon. Some people point out, of course, that Trump can't legally withdraw from NATO, not just on a whim. The thing is that if Europeans no longer trust in the US adherence to the Mutual Defence Clause, then NATO's dead, regardless of the official membership. I mean, that's it. Definitionally dead. If Trump doesn't believe in Article 5 and the other NATO members pleasantly surprise him when the crisis arrives, makes relatively little difference. The US already has the biggest defence force on the planet. It lost nothing by presuming it was on its own, which is good because in alienating its allies as it is, probably it's going to get there in due course. But if the promises that Europe relied upon no longer hold good, then Europe is in trouble unless it fundamentally changes behaviours. And they will do so for as long as possible while pretending that nothing has changed. And that doesn't mean they don't recognise that it's changed. More to the point is what has happened to the common values that NATO was there to defend. If the US now chooses, it's still a choice. Political realities in the US could still revert to the mean. But if it chooses to continue its current direction of travel, to embrace the values of the former aggressors, then an alliance in defence of common values is defunct because those values are no longer held in common. And if the US aligns itself with Russia, then it is counterintuitive that the existence of the name of NATO would any longer deter Russia. No stability, no deterrence, hence no NATO. Not only that, but the internal trust is then poisoned. Trump appointed a head of security services considered by a number of US allies as compromised and a potential Russian asset, Tulsi Gabbard. That leaves countries starting to worry about what intelligence any longer can or should be shared with Washington, what intelligence Washington has that they may be deciding likewise not to share with them. Julie Smith, former US ambassador to NATO, said this: "There are a lot of whispers in the halls of NATO about the future of intelligence sharing within the alliance." Daniel Stanton, former official in Canada's Foreign Intelligence Service, said, "There's less of a consensus about who the common enemy is. people are going to be more reticent to share. The breakdown of trust internally is just another sign that NATO is deceased. An alliance without trust is not an alliance as we traditionally understand it. I tend to think it would be better to state reality up front. By now, I think everything I've said in this video is known fully to the various players on the world stage. The conceit of Europeans that if they pretend everything's still normal, then it will give them cover while they try to build their position. I think that is plainly false. Indeed, Russia has already declared that it sees Europe building up its defences as a new threat to Russia, requiring a response. Nobody is fooling anybody, except for the wider public, who probably, let's face it, have a right to know what's really going on.